So CrowdStrike was responsible for a large-scale, I guess, bricking of millions of computers around the planet just a couple of weeks before these conferences took place. And discussion of how this happened and what the impacts of it looked like took center stage in a lot of different cases. So let's go over briefly what happened here. On July 19th, there was an update, channel file 291, that went out from CrowdStrike. This was intended to improve name pipe execution detection and some other security updates for the CrowdStrike Falcon system in general. The update unfortunately contained a logic flaw called a null pointer error. And for those of you that are not programmers, don't worry, I'm not going into super depth on what that means. But realistically, it just means that at some point in the operation of the software, the software tried to access some part of the operating system that wasn't there. And because of that, it throws an error. It crashes the computer system it's running on, and it just puts it into this like unkillable boot loop at that point in time. We like to refer to that as the blue screen of death. And this hit about 8.5 million different computers across the planet within about an hour and a half's worth of time. Now, CrowdStrike, to their credit, was able to identify this, and they were able to stop this from pushing out any further. But unfortunately, at that point, the damage was done. Now, I threw this picture on here just because it was a perfect example of what actually happened. This is a picture of the airport right here in Missoula, where I'm sitting right now. And this picture was taken by Tom Pohl, our head of penetration test, as he was trying to board a flight. And you can see the Delta counter, and then you can also see that big blue recovery screen on the monitor next to him. Now, he was not the only one that suffered because of this. There were thousands upon thousands of flights canceled. Hospitals had to go back to pad and pen. Financial institutions couldn't function properly. I mean, this was pretty huge. Now, the good news here was that this was not another giant supply chain attack. This was not SolarWind. But I love this quote from Daniel Oakley down here at the bottom. CrowdStrike did not experience a security incident. They were the security incident. And that was evident in the overall damage. As I mentioned before, 8.5 million computers worldwide went down that we know of. Now, while this is less than 1% of the overall number of Microsoft Windows computers out there, this is still very, very significant based on the types of organizations that run CrowdStrike and were running these computer systems. Fortunately for us too, Mac and Linux systems were not impacted, but the damage again was kind of done at that point. More interestingly though, the fallout from this led to a massive spike in spear phishing. And while we were talking about KnowBe4 and social engineering, I mean, this came to mind as something that we should probably talk about. When we see someone like a hardware or software vendor suffer a security incident, there is always going to be some level of follow-on from attackers that will try to exploit that organization's misfortune. And this was no different. We saw a big number of phishing emails go out that supposedly had a fix for the CrowdStrike problem because it wasn't that easy to get through. Most of the time, though, these were things like data wipers or malware or information stealing Trojans or something along those lines. These were not fixes for the actual problem that we were going through, as should be obvious. But a lot of people did unfortunately fall for this because when your computer systems are down, and you're trying everything you can to get back up and going, a convincing enough phishing email that claims to be from the vendor responsible for the problem may be enough to get past your normal security protocols at that point, especially if you're in a major hurry. So what made this actually so impactful? And this is where we really get into the process behind how we recover from something like a ransomware attack. Honestly, there were a lot of analogs between these two events. Here's the instructions that CrowdStrike gave us. They wanted us to boot the computer into safe mode and then get into the Windows recovery environment. They wanted to navigate to a specific folder, delete a specific file, and then we could reboot the computer normally, which sounds pretty simple, right? I mean, that sounds like pretty basic activity that almost any junior IT staff could do. But there were problems associated with that a lot of people didn't think about at first. One of them is the use of BitLocker. Now, I want to be very clear here. The use of BitLocker is a best practice. You absolutely should be using it. But it also means if you try to boot into something like safe mode or into the Windows recovery environment, you need that BitLocker key to be able to actually recover the contents of that hard drive. You also need administrative level access. The file that you had to delete was in a protected folder, and if you didn't have admin access, you couldn't get to it. Now, this is also a problem because if we're looking at, especially at scale, a large number of computer systems, we should realistically have different admin passwords for every single one of those machines. And in cases where people did, this actually turned out to be a problem. Not saying that you should not do that. We should not be using the same admin password for every computer. But we did need to point out that the use of these best practices was kind of a hindrance for some people. In fact, one of our partners ended up having several thousand computer systems go down. They realized pretty quickly that it was going to take about 20 minutes or so per computer with hands-on keyboard to get these things back up and running. That's a lot of time that needs to be sunk into this recovery process. It's also why we need to test before updating. So when you think about like your patching schedule and updating security software, especially things that are hooked deep into your operating system, something like CrowdStrike, you need to think, how early do you deploy patches? I mean, do you just automatically deploy as soon as the vendor sends it, or do you sandbox that patch first? Do you allow automatic patching on these third-party applications? And then what resources do you have if a patch fails? This should all be included in your incident response plan, and it should, again, be something that you test periodically when you're looking at things like disaster recovery. Now, we are seeing a little bit of fallout from this already. As I mentioned before, with the screenshot or with the picture you saw, Delta suffered a pretty significant outage from this. So did other airlines around the world. But we're starting to see, again, lawsuits starting to pile up, and we're starting to see some finger pointing begin to happen. So this will be some interesting cybersecurity soap opera as we move forward. Microsoft claims that they were offered help by CrowdStrike and by Microsoft, but they declined it because, well, they had their own reasons for doing that. But because of that, there is a little bit of confusion about why you wouldn't allow the security vendor, who, I mean, likely has a deep level of knowledge about what just happened, to come in and assist you. Why you want to strike out on your own like that. Personally, I can see arguments both ways, but well, again, we'll see how this goes. Thank you so much, everyone. Again, my name is Matt Duran, Director of Training and Research for LMG Security. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out at any time. We would love to hear from you. You can reach me at info@lmgsecurity.com, find me on LinkedIn, or follow us on Twitter. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.